If you're a regular viewer of my interviews, you know that we talk a lot about energy innovation. And I mean, we're in an energy transition. It's driven by new technologies and the transition from hydrocarbons to electricity generated by low carbon technologies. And so innovation is a big part of that. And we report on it. And Pollution Probe out of Toronto has released a new report about innovation sandboxes. So that really got my attention. We're going to be talking to Richard Carlson from Pollution Probe. So welcome to the interview, Richard.
Thank you, Markham. It's great to be here.
Maybe let's start with an overview of your report, if you don't mind.
Okay, this is actually the third report we've done looking at innovation. The first one we came out about a year and a half ago, and that was really a survey where we talked to energy stakeholders all across Canada from every jurisdiction, asking what is the barriers, what's the problem with deploying innovation in your jurisdiction. And what we heard generally was that technology is no longer the barrier. We have the technology. The real barrier to innovation, to deploying innovation, is really down to the business models, the regulatory barriers, the system barriers. And innovation sandboxes came up repeatedly as one of those ways of getting around those barriers. So we then decided to launch an innovation sandbox project. So when I say we, this is a project that Pollution Probe is running in partnership with Quest, which is another NGO, national NGO looking at smart energy communities. So we decided to launch this Innovation Sandboxes project, and we did a report in the summer looking at the international experience innovation sandboxes, because there are a number of international jurisdictions that have innovation sandboxes. So we really looked at what we could learn from the international experience. This report that was released today, depending on when you're listening to this, was really looking at how is innovation done in Canada? What are the barriers to deploying innovation, to accelerate the deployment of innovation in Canada? And how, or if even, innovation sandboxes can play a role in that.
Let's talk about what is an innovation sandbox.
Well, an innovation sandbox is a new policy response to how do we deploy innovation. And it doesn't come from the energy sector. The first innovation sandbox is actually developed in the fintech sector, initially in the United Kingdom. And they're really about, you have all these new technologies coming in the financial tech sector, like robo-advisors and cryptocurrencies. And it was like, they didn't quite fit into the financial regulatory system. So they're looking at how can we create capture this knowledge, capture these benefits in a way that protects people. So they created an innovation sandbox, and then that was translated down to the energy sector, again, the first time in the United Kingdom, and has since been spread globally. So the idea of an innovation sandbox, it's really a way of collaboration, of bringing people together so they can learn how to deploy innovation, having some trials so that they can kind of experiment with what are the real barriers, and then using that information to help change and improve policy and regulatory responses. So in our definition of an innovation sandbox, we have quite a broad definition of an innovation sandbox. And we say there are 4 areas. So the first area is what we call an innovation hub. And that's really an area where innovators can come together. It's a place of collaboration. It's a place of knowledge sharing. So it's people learning what worked in other jurisdictions and other places and what didn't work. The second was an inquiry hub, because as you know, and as I keep on getting told repeatedly whenever I talk about energy to someone who's not in the energy sector, it's very complicated. And innovators, especially from outside the energy sector, they don't understand it, so they need help. What does regulation mean to them? Does their innovation actually have a regulatory barrier, or do they just think it does? How does this all work? And they need help finding that out. And third, there's an element of a regulatory trial. So that would be like a time-limited derogation from a regulation. So you would go in and say, I want to do this business model, but this particular regulation is stopping me. So a regulatory authority could say, okay, you don't have to adhere to that regulation for 2 years or 3 years or 4 years or whatever. And then you do that and you report back to us. And the idea is it's a controlled experiment, so that if it blows up and it ends up being a problem and consumers are hurt, they can say, oh, okay, well, we didn't actually, consumers weren't greatly affected by it. It would just get lost around the noise. So it's a way of testing it. And the fourth one is really using all this information to inform regulatory and policy development across Canada.
Gotcha. Let me give you a case study, as it were, and you tell me how this might apply. So in BC Hydro's, I'm doing some work on this. Clean energy, Clean BC, which is the Oregon government's climate policies, envisions extensive electrification of the BC economy in order to bring down GHG emissions between now and 2050. In order to do that, the studies that I've reviewed show that BC power consumption, electricity consumption, will have to rise by 2 to 3 times what it is today. So then that raises the question, well, how are you going to do that? And you can't build, BC Hydro is not building any more dams. Other jurisdictions are moved to independent system operators, breaking them away from crown corporations like BC Hydro. It introduces a whole range of complexity that isn't even being discussed in BC currently, but needs to be. Is this a prime area where you could go in and do an innovation sandbox, talk about technology, stakeholders, regulations, all of that stuff?
Well, yes, you could do that as a way of trying to bring innovation in. So how do we help BC do that? Say, for example, one area could be, especially on the electrification of transportation. How do you trial business models around smart charging, for example, where consumers, owners of EVs, can receive benefits for allowing their EV to be charged at off-peak hours, as opposed to at 5 or 6 o'clock when everyone gets home from work or someone's going away to work anymore. But back when things get to normal, when how can we do the smart charging? And there would be different business models. So maybe a company could come in and say, right now, they cannot sell the electricity because BC Hydro has a monopoly, especially in the Lower Mainland. So that maybe there'd be a temporary derogation where some company could come in and say, we can then arbitrage the smart charging in order to buy electricity in BC Hydro and resell it to the EV customer, and do that in a way that tries to minimize the electricity demand so you can spread out that peak demand. That would be one potential area for, say, a regulatory trial. And then there could be a number of them being done across BC looking at this. And then all this information would be shared. So there would be regular check-ins with everybody has slightly different business models, and they could come and say, okay, this worked here, this didn't work here, oh, that worked here. And it would allow development so that people could find out what is the best way to do this. And that really gets down to where we need the innovation, because we have the technology to do this. It's really, how do we fit the pieces together in a particular jurisdiction?
Last question, Richard. Who takes the lead role on this? Is it government? Is it business? Is it NGOs? Who is it?
Well, in the end, if you're going to be looking at an innovation sandbox, there has to be a public authority running it. And those kind of changes. In a lot of jurisdictions, energy regulators tend to take on that role of owning the sandbox because they're in charge of the regulatory authorities. But that's not always the case. When we looked internationally, there are some cases where that didn't happen. There's a case in Austria, where a state research agency was tasked with owning the innovation sandbox. And that was done deliberately because the government did not think that the regulator would be innovative enough. And so they wanted the state regulate, they wanted the innovation company to be doing this. In other cases, it was in Belgium, for example, it's an industrial consortium. So it is kind of a consortium of the different players. And a lot of this comes down to what we kind of want from the innovation sandbox. If we have the idea that the point of an innovation sandbox, we'd hope, would be, how do we deploy innovation, clean tech innovation, in a way that reduces our emissions, that benefits consumers, that can reduce bills? How do we deploy this faster? But that kind of takes on a different angle. In Austria, when it's under the research organization, it was very much focused on how do we meet our targets. And so they were giving money to help meet the targets. Well, in the UK, where the regulator is in charge of it, it was very much on how do we improve the consumer experience. It was very much on a regulatory focus. So there's going to be different in different jurisdictions. And that's why, like, our project is a 4-year project where we're doing our research now. But the goal of the project is we're going to go in and help jurisdictions develop innovation sandbox frameworks. And those aren't cookie cutter. You can't take one that worked in the UK and take it to Ontario or take it to Alberta and one of Alberta. It wouldn't work. You really need to sit down and work with all the stakeholders and say, what do you want to accomplish? What are the barriers to innovation in your particular jurisdiction, which are going to be very different? And in what area? Is it not just electricity, but you have natural gas, the thermal side, you have transportation, biofuels, maybe that would be, all this has to kind of come together.
Richard, thank you very much for this. This makes a lot of sense to me because in the many, many interviews I do with energy experts around the world, the issue of non-technology barriers to technology adoption comes up over and over again, whether it's finance, regulation, whatever it might be. And if this seems to be a structured approach to resolving that issue, and certainly something that bears consideration in Canada.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure talking to you.